Mom, Vanessa thinks it might be better if you avoid the family photos tonight. My son whispered those words to me at the entrance of my grandson's wedding while a violin played softly somewhere behind us and guests sipped champagne beneath glowing vineyard lights. For a moment, I honestly thought I misunderstood him. I stood there holding a wrapped wedding gift against my chest, while warm Napa Valley wind moved gently through the rows of grapevines surrounding the estate. The wedding venue looked like something from a magazine. White roses everywhere, fairy lights hanging from olive trees, long wooden tables covered in candles and crystal glasses stretching across the courtyard beneath the California sunset. And somehow, standing there in my pale blue dress with my silver hair carefully curled for the occasion, I had never felt more invisible in my life. Michael avoided looking directly at me while speaking. That hurt almost more than the words themselves. My son was 46 years old now, but in that moment he suddenly reminded me of the little boy who used to hide broken report cards behind his back because guilt always made him stare at the floor. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. He sighed softly, already uncomfortable. "It is just, Vanessa wants the wedding photos to stay streamlined." Streamlined. Such an elegant word for humiliation. Behind him, guests laughed near the vineyard bar, while servers carried trays of sparkling wine through the crowd. Somewhere inside the reception tent, my grandson Ethan was probably adjusting his tie nervously while preparing to marry the woman he loved. And outside, at the entrance to the celebration, my own son stood asking me to disappear politely from the family pictures because apparently my presence disrupted the aesthetic. "I am his grandmother," I said carefully, still trying to understand how this conversation was happening at all. "Of course." Michael lowered his voice further. "Nobody is saying otherwise. Vanessa just thinks tonight should focus on the younger generation." I stared at him while something inside my chest slowly tightened. The younger generation. Funny phrase considering I quietly helped pay for most of this wedding. The vineyard deposit alone cost more than my first house back in 1978. Ethan never asked me directly for help. He did not have to. Michael called 6 months earlier sounding stressed about unexpected venue expenses, and before the conversation ended, I transferred $30,000 into his account because that is what mothers do. Or at least what I always believed mothers were supposed to do. "I see," I whispered. Michael finally looked at me then, relieved I was not causing a scene. "Thank you for understanding." Understanding. Another beautiful word people use when they want your silence more than your feelings. He touched my elbow lightly before walking back toward the reception area without waiting for my response. I remained standing there alone near the entrance while guests moved around me carrying gift bags and smiling beneath the golden California sunset. Nobody noticed my humiliation because wealthy weddings teach people how to ignore discomfort gracefully. I took a slow breath and forced myself to keep walking. The reception space smelled faintly like expensive wine and fresh flowers. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers near the dance floor, while waiters passed tiny crab cakes and champagne flutes through the crowd. Everything looked perfect, beautiful, carefully designed. And somehow my chair sat beside the kitchen doors near the back corner of the tent beside a portable service station stacked with extra napkins and silverware. Not the family table near the bride and groom. Not even close. I stared at the seating chart for several seconds just to make sure I was reading correctly. Eleanor Brooks. Table 17. Behind me, 2 women I recognized from Michael's neighborhood association whispered quietly while pretending to study the floral arrangements. I thought she was the groom's grandmother. Apparently there was some family tension. Family tension. Such a delicate way to describe public rejection. I sat down slowly at my table, while servers rushed in and out through the kitchen doors beside me carrying trays of food. Every few minutes the swinging doors opened wide enough for bursts of heat and noise from the catering staff inside to spill into the elegant reception space. Across the vineyard courtyard, I could see the real family tables glowing warmly beneath hanging lights. Michael laughing beside Vanessa. Ethan holding Olivia's hand while photographers captured candid moments around them. Not once did anyone look toward me. A waitress refilled my water glass and smiled kindly. "Beautiful wedding, huh?" I nodded politely. "Very beautiful." The violin music continued softly while twilight settled across the vineyards outside. Around me, guests toasted love and family while I sat alone beside the service entrance listening to silverware clatter in the kitchen every time the doors swung open behind my chair. Then suddenly another realization hit me with quiet force. This was not the first time they pushed me gently toward the edges of family life. It was simply the first time they finally stopped hiding it. The wedding ceremony itself lasted only 20 minutes, but humiliation stretches time in strange ways. I sat alone at table 17 watching my grandson exchange vows beneath an arch covered in white roses while waiters slipped in and out through the kitchen doors behind me carrying trays of champagne. Every time the doors swung open, I caught flashes of stainless steel counters and exhausted catering staff moving quickly under harsh fluorescent lights. Somehow that felt fitting. The grandmother of the groom, seated halfway between the reception and the service entrance like an afterthought nobody knew where to place elegantly. Ethan looked handsome standing beneath the vineyard lights in his dark tuxedo. Olivia's veil moved softly in the evening breeze while guests smiled and dabbed tears from their eyes during the vows. I cried too, quietly, because despite everything, I truly loved my grandson. I remembered holding him against my chest the day he was born while Michael stood beside the hospital bed, crying openly from happiness. I remembered helping him with homework after school when Michael and Vanessa both worked late. I remembered teaching him how to drive in the empty church parking lot near our old neighborhood because his parents were too busy that summer. Strange how family memories survive even after people start treating you like furniture. During cocktail hour, nobody from the immediate family table approached me except Ethan briefly after the ceremony. He hugged me tightly near the vineyard path while photographers shouted instructions nearby. "Grandma, thank you for coming," he whispered warmly. For one painful second, I almost told him everything. The seating chart, Michael's whisper at the entrance, the family photos I was quietly excluded from earlier beside the olive trees. But Ethan looked genuinely happy standing there in his wedding tuxedo with sunlight fading gold across the vineyards behind him. I could not ruin that expression for him. "You look wonderful," I said instead, smoothing the front of his jacket gently like I used to when he was little. Then Vanessa appeared almost immediately beside us with her perfect smile frozen tightly in place. "Ethan, sweetheart, the photographer needs you near the bridal party." She barely glanced at me while speaking. Ethan squeezed my hand once before hurrying away across the courtyard. Vanessa remained standing there afterward, holding a champagne flute between manicured fingers. "Thank you for understanding about the photos earlier," she said quietly. Understanding again. Everybody at this wedding seemed deeply invested in my silence. "Of course," I answered softly. "We just wanted tonight to feel modern and clean aesthetically." Modern and clean aesthetically. Apparently 71-year-old grandmothers disrupted the visual balance of vineyard weddings now. Vanessa smiled politely before walking away toward the family tables beneath the glowing string lights. I watched her disappear into laughter and expensive perfume, while something inside me finally stopped making excuses for people. The truth was no longer subtle anymore. They were embarrassed by my age, my presence, my existence outside practical usefulness. During dinner, I sat beside 3 distant relatives from Olivia's side of the family who politely introduced themselves before immediately drifting back into conversations that did not include me. Across the reception space, Michael raised champagne glasses with guests while Vanessa moved gracefully from table to table greeting everyone like a lifestyle magazine hostess. Not once did either of them look toward the back corner where I sat beside the kitchen doors. Then halfway through the meal, the giant projector screens near the dance floor flickered on for the wedding slideshow. Childhood photos, family vacations, graduation pictures, Ethan growing up through carefully selected memories displayed beneath soft piano music. I smiled at first seeing him as a little boy holding birthday cakes and baseball trophies. Then slowly another realization settled heavily into my chest. I was barely in any of the photographs. Family trips to Hawaii without me. Christmas mornings where I apparently took every picture instead of appearing in them. Thanksgiving dinners at Michael's house, where somehow my chair always sat outside the frame. 20 years of memories edited carefully enough that I almost disappeared completely. Around me, guests laughed warmly at funny childhood pictures while I stared silently at the screen, realizing this wedding was not the first time my family quietly erased me. It was simply the first time they did it publicly enough that I could no longer pretend not to notice. "Beautiful family," one woman beside me commented softly during the slideshow. I swallowed carefully before answering. "Yes." But even as I said the word, another memory surfaced painfully clear. 3 years earlier, Vanessa organized a family-only trip to Cabo for Michael's 50th birthday. I found out accidentally through Facebook photos after the trip ended. When I confronted Michael gently afterward, he looked embarrassed and said, "We assumed you would not want to travel that far." The year before that, Ethan's college graduation dinner happened without inviting me because apparently reservations were limited. Every explanation sounded reasonable alone. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore anymore. Somewhere along the years, my family stopped seeing me as part of their emotional life and started seeing me as a helpful background figure instead. Babysitting, tuition help, emergency loans, birthday checks, but never fully present inside the memories themselves. A server interrupted my thoughts while placing dessert plates on the table. Tiny lemon cakes decorated with edible gold flakes and lavender cream. Expensive, beautiful, tasteless. Across the reception tent, Michael stood to make his father of the groom speech while guests applauded warmly beneath the vineyard lights. I straightened quietly in my chair near the kitchen doors while violin music faded softly into silence around us. Then my son raised his champagne glass toward the crowd and smiled proudly. "Family means everything to us tonight," he began. I looked down slowly at my untouched dessert plate while catering staff pushed another tray of dishes through the service doors behind me. And suddenly, for the first time all evening, I no longer felt hurt. I felt awake. Michael's speech lasted nearly 10 minutes. Long enough for the violin music to fade completely and for candles across the vineyard tables to burn lower against the cool Napa evening air. He spoke about family traditions, unconditional love, and how proud he was watching Ethan become a man who values loyalty and kindness. I sat beside the kitchen doors listening to every word while waiters rushed behind me carrying trays of empty champagne glasses back into the catering tent. Loyalty, kindness. Funny how easily people praise virtues they quietly abandoned years earlier. Guests applauded warmly when Michael finished speaking. Vanessa wiped fake tears from beneath perfectly applied makeup, while Ethan hugged his father near the dance floor. From the outside, they looked like the ideal family. Wealthy, elegant, close. Nobody watching that speech would ever guess Michael had once forgotten my birthday entirely because Vanessa booked a couple's retreat the same weekend. Nobody would know I spent Thanksgiving alone 2 years earlier reheating frozen turkey slices while Facebook filled with photographs of their intimate family gathering in Lake Tahoe. Family gathering apparently meant everybody except me. Sitting there at table 17 beneath the glow of vineyard lights, memories started surfacing one after another with painful clarity. Ethan's high school graduation party where Vanessa insisted seating was limited, so I arrived late and left early after spending most of the evening standing near the kitchen helping servers refill drinks because nobody saved me a chair. The Disney vacation Michael booked for the entire family while telling me afterward, "We figured theme parks would be too exhausting for you anyway." Christmas mornings where my gifts slowly became gift cards ordered online at the last minute, while I still spent weeks choosing thoughtful presents for everyone else. None of those moments seemed cruel individually. That is how emotional exclusion works in families. Quietly, politely. One small dismissal at a time until eventually you realize your absence would barely disrupt anything at all. During dinner service, a young waitress accidentally knocked over a champagne glass near my table. It shattered softly across the stone floor beside the kitchen doors. She looked mortified immediately. "I am so sorry." I smiled gently while helping her gather napkins before she could kneel beside the broken glass herself. "It is all right, sweetheart." She thanked me twice afterward before hurrying back toward the kitchen. Funny how strangers still managed warmth without effort, while my own family treated me like an inconvenient detail in the wedding decor. Across the reception space, photographers gathered everyone near the vineyard arch for another round of family portraits. Michael stood beside Vanessa with one arm proudly around Ethan, while Olivia's parents moved into position nearby. Laughter drifted softly through the evening air, while camera flashes lit the rows of grapevines behind them. Nobody called my name. Nobody looked toward table 17 at all. I watched silently while my family arranged themselves into perfect memories without me standing anywhere inside the frame. Then suddenly another realization settled heavily into my chest. This was not about forgetting me anymore. Forgetting happens accidentally. This was editing. Deliberate. Careful. Permanent. A voice beside me interrupted my thoughts gently. Mind if I sit here? I looked up and nearly cried from relief seeing Grace Whitmore standing beside the table holding 2 glasses of white wine. Grace and I had been friends since our children attended elementary school together decades earlier. She looked elegant, as always, in a dark green silk dress, with silver hair pinned carefully at the back of her neck. "Please," I said softly. Grace sat beside me and followed my gaze toward the family photo session happening across the courtyard. "I saw what Michael said to you at the entrance." Shame flushed through me immediately despite everything. I did not realize anyone noticed. Grace laughed quietly under her breath. "Eleanor, half this wedding noticed." I looked down at my untouched dessert plate while violin music resumed softly near the dance floor. Maybe Vanessa was right. Old women probably do ruin luxury wedding aesthetics. Grace turned toward me, so sharply her wine nearly spilled. "Do not you dare say that." Her voice stayed low but fierce. "You paid for half this wedding." I blinked slowly. "Excuse me." Grace stared at me in disbelief. "Michael told everyone you funded the vineyard deposit when their original venue fell apart." The room suddenly felt strangely distant around me. "He told people that?" "Of course." Grace frowned slightly. "You did not know?" "No. Apparently, I only mattered privately when money was needed. Publicly, they preferred pretending I barely existed at all." Grace reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "Vanessa has been obsessed with appearances since the engagement party. Last month, she actually complained older relatives would make the wedding look too traditional online." I laughed softly then because the sentence hurt too much to process any other way. Somewhere across the courtyard, my grandson danced beneath glowing string lights while guests toasted love and family beside vineyard rows stretching endlessly into the dark California hills. And sitting near the kitchen doors with the only honest person at the reception beside me, I finally stopped wondering whether I was overreacting. Grace followed my silence for a moment before speaking again. "You know what the saddest part is?" I looked toward her quietly. "Michael used to worship you when he was little." Tears burned suddenly behind my eyes hearing that. Because she was right. My son once cried for 3 days at summer camp because he missed home too much. He once saved allowance money for months just to buy me perfume from the mall for Mother's Day when he was 12. Somewhere between ambition, money, and Vanessa's carefully curated lifestyle, that boy disappeared completely. Across the reception area, Michael raised another champagne glass toward guests while smiling proudly beneath the vineyard lights. And for the first time all evening, instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt something colder, clearer. The painful understanding that some people do not stop loving you suddenly. They simply stop seeing your humanity once your usefulness becomes routine. After the first dance, servers cleared dinner plates while guests drifted toward the outdoor wine bar beneath the vineyard lights. The evening air had turned cooler now, carrying the faint smell of lavender and expensive cigars through the Napa hills. Somewhere near the dance floor, Olivia laughed while Ethan spun her gently beneath hanging strings of warm white lights. They looked genuinely happy together, young enough to still believe love automatically means loyalty. I hoped for their sake life stayed kinder to them than it had to most couples I knew. Grace and I remained near the back tables sipping coffee while the reception slowly transformed into louder music and dancing. Around us, guests smiled into phones taking photographs beneath glowing olive trees, while photographers directed relatives into carefully posed moments that would eventually flood social media by morning. "You know," Grace said quietly while watching Michael across the courtyard, "Vanessa has been nervous about money for months." I looked toward her slowly. "What kind of money?" Grace hesitated before lowering her voice slightly. "Michael invested heavily in some restaurant partnership last year. Apparently, it failed badly." Suddenly, several strange conversations from recent months resurfaced inside my head. Michael casually asking whether I still plan to keep my retirement savings in low-risk accounts. Vanessa mentioning rising mortgage rates during Christmas dinner. The sudden increase in family invitations whenever bills or tuition payments appeared unexpectedly. "How bad?" I asked softly. Grace stared into her coffee cup before answering. "From what I heard, they refinanced the house twice already." I felt something cold settle quietly inside my chest. Not shock exactly. Recognition. Suddenly the wedding venue, the expensive flowers, the polished appearance of success surrounding tonight all looked different somehow. More desperate. More performative. That is why they needed help with the wedding, I murmured. Grace nodded once. And honestly, I think Michael planned to ask you for more after the honeymoon. I stared silently across the vineyard while realization moved through me with painful clarity. The $30,000 for the venue. The graduation checks. The emergency loans over the years. Every family gathering where I suddenly became important again right before someone needed financial help. Maybe Vanessa did not want me in the wedding photographs because deep down, my presence reminded her too much of who actually funded the lifestyle she wanted everyone else admiring tonight. Across the reception space, Michael stood laughing with business partners near the wine bar, while Vanessa posed for another set of photographs beside the floral arch. Beautiful. Successful. Happy. Yet somehow all I could see now was exhaustion hiding beneath expensive clothing. Grace reached over and squeezed my hand gently. Eleanor, you do not owe them anything else. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes hearing that because for most of my life, I believed motherhood meant permanent obligation. Endless understanding. Endless forgiveness. Endless giving. Even after my husband died 12 years earlier, and I spent lonely nights balancing retirement accounts alone, I still quietly covered family expenses whenever Michael sounded stressed enough on the phone. Ethan's college tuition. Vanessa's brother's rehab program after his second relapse. Emergency roof repairs during the pandemic. I even sold my diamond anniversary bracelet 2 years ago because Michael's business taxes unexpectedly doubled. Nobody at this wedding knew that. Nobody applauding Michael's speech about family loyalty understood the grandmother sitting beside the kitchen doors quietly financed half the life they admired. A slow song began playing near the dance floor, while couples moved closer together beneath the vineyard lights. Ethan and Olivia danced nearby looking young and hopeful, while camera flashes flickered softly around them. Then suddenly Ethan glanced toward my table and frowned slightly. For the first time all evening, I think he finally noticed where I was sitting. He whispered something quietly to Olivia before walking toward me across the courtyard. "Grandma," he said softly once he reached the table. "Why are you sitting back here?" I looked up at him beneath the glowing lights while music drifted softly through the cool Napa air. His expression looked genuinely confused. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Just confused enough that I realized nobody ever told him the truth about the seating arrangement at all. "It is all right, sweetheart." He glanced toward the kitchen doors behind my chair, then toward the distant family tables near the dance floor. "No, it is not." Before I could stop him, Ethan turned and walked directly toward Michael and Vanessa near the bar. I watched their conversation unfold silently across the courtyard while Grace sat beside me pretending not to notice. Michael's face tightened immediately. Vanessa crossed both arms sharply. Ethan shook his head once, visibly frustrated, before looking back toward me again. For several long seconds, the entire wedding seemed suspended strangely beneath the vineyard lights, while generations of quiet family tension finally surfaced into the open. Then Michael walked toward me across the courtyard with the exact expression fathers use before scolding children privately. Except tonight, I was no longer interested in protecting his comfort. "Mom," he whispered sharply once he reached the table. "There is no reason to create drama tonight." Drama. Such an interesting word for truth people hoped would stay hidden. I looked up at my son calmly, while soft jazz music drifted through the vineyards behind him. "Michael," I said quietly, "I have spent years helping you preserve appearances." His jaw tightened immediately. "What does that mean?" I glanced toward the family tables glowing warmly near the dance floor where guests still toasted love and happiness without noticing us. Then slowly, for the first time all evening, I smiled. Not bitterly. Not sadly. Just clearly. "It means I finally understand why you wanted me out of the photographs." Michael's face lost color instantly. And somewhere deep inside me, something that had spent years aching finally went still. Michael stared at me for several seconds after that. His expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and irritation. Around us, guests continued dancing beneath vineyard lights, while laughter drifted softly through the cool Napa air. Nobody nearby realized an entire family dynamic was quietly collapsing beside the kitchen entrance. "Mom," he said finally, lowering his voice further, "this is not the time." I looked calmly at my son standing there in his expensive tuxedo with worry lines pressed deeply across his forehead, despite the celebration happening around him. "No," I answered softly. The time was probably years ago. His jaw tightened immediately. You are overthinking this. Overthinking. Another elegant phrase people use when they want you to ignore painful truths conveniently. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared beside him carrying a champagne flute and the same perfectly controlled smile she wore all evening. Everything all right over here? She asked lightly, though her eyes already looked defensive. Michael exhaled sharply beside her. Mom is upset about the seating arrangement. Vanessa laughed softly under her breath, like the situation itself felt exhausting. Eleanor, we already explained the photography issue earlier. Photography issue. As though I was poor lighting instead of family. Grace remained silent beside me, but I could feel her anger radiating through the table. Actually, I said calmly, I think we are finally discussing something much bigger than photographs. Vanessa's expression shifted slightly then. More cautious now. What exactly does that mean? I looked across the vineyard toward Ethan laughing beside Olivia beneath hanging lights while guests gathered around the dance floor taking pictures. Then I looked back at my son and daughter-in-law standing stiffly beside table 17. It means I finally realized I only seem to belong in this family when I am useful privately. Silence settled immediately between us. Even the music from the reception suddenly sounded far away somehow. Vanessa crossed both arms tightly against her dress. That is completely unfair. Is it? My voice remained gentle enough that nearby guests still paid no attention. The wedding venue deposit came from my retirement account. Michael looked down instantly. Mom, Ethan's tuition came from my retirement account too. Vanessa opened her mouth slightly before closing it again. The down payment on your first house. Your brother's rehab bills. Half the vacations you posted online pretending financial success. I smiled faintly then, though nothing about the feeling resembled happiness. Apparently my money photographs beautifully. I just do not. Michael rubbed one hand across his face while Vanessa's cheeks flushed red beneath the vineyard lights. For a moment nobody spoke at all. Then finally Vanessa whispered sharply, We did not ask you to say those things here. I looked around the reception space quietly. Nobody else still noticed us. The wedding band continued playing slow jazz while servers carried trays of desserts through the crowd. Public humiliation does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it happens in whispers beside service doors while everyone else keeps dancing. You never asked me how I felt either, I answered softly. Michael glanced nervously toward the family tables before lowering his voice even further. Please. Tonight is about Ethan. There it was. The final shield people always hide behind after causing pain. Celebration. Timing. Keeping the peace. You are right, I said gently. Tonight should absolutely be about Ethan. Then I stood slowly from the table for the first time all evening. Grace looked up at me immediately. Eleanor. But I simply smoothed the front of my blue dress and reached for the champagne glass sitting untouched beside my plate. Across the reception tent, the wedding coordinator tapped lightly on the microphone asking for final speeches before cake cutting. Michael's face immediately lost color when he realized where I was walking. Mom, he whispered sharply, stepping toward me. Do not do this. I paused beside him calmly. Do what? Please. His voice cracked slightly now. Not tonight. Funny how suddenly my emotions mattered once public perception became involved. I looked directly into my son's eyes while vineyard lights reflected softly across the polished dance floor behind him. Michael, I said quietly, I spent years protecting your image at the expense of my dignity. Then before he could answer, I walked calmly toward the microphone stand near the center of the reception. The room remained warm and beautiful around me. Candlelight flickered against wine glasses. Guests smiled politely while expecting another sentimental family toast. Ethan looked surprised, but genuinely happy seeing me approach the front. Vanessa looked horrified. I accepted the microphone gently from the wedding coordinator while soft conversation faded across the vineyard tables. I promise this will be brief, I said calmly once the room settled quiet enough to hear me. My voice sounded steady. Clear. Stronger than I felt inside. I looked toward Ethan first. I have loved this young man since the day he arrived in this world screaming loud enough to terrify every nurse in the hospital. Soft laughter moved through the crowd. Ethan smiled warmly beneath the lights. And tonight, watching him marry someone he truly loves has reminded me how important kindness really is inside families. The room remained perfectly silent now. Somewhere near the back, I heard Vanessa shift uncomfortably in her chair. I continued anyway. Over the years, I have been very proud to help build this family quietly. Sometimes emotionally, sometimes financially, usually both. Several guests exchanged quick glances then. But tonight, more than anything, I hope Ethan and Olivia always remember something simple. I looked directly toward my grandson beneath the vineyard lights. The people who love you should never make you feel invisible just because they become accustomed to your generosity. Silence spread instantly across the entire reception tent afterward, deep enough that even the kitchen noise behind table 17 suddenly disappeared. Ethan looked confused. Olivia looked uncomfortable. Michael stared at the floor completely motionless beside Vanessa. I smiled softly toward the bride and groom before handing the microphone back to the stunned coordinator. Then I returned calmly to my table beside the kitchen doors while hundreds of tiny vineyard lights glowed warmly overhead and nobody in the room could pretend not to understand what I meant anymore. The silence after my speech lasted only a few seconds, but it changed the entire atmosphere of the wedding permanently. Before that moment, the evening felt polished, controlled, beautiful in the artificial way luxury events are designed to feel. Afterward, everything looked slightly cracked beneath the vineyard lights. Guests smiled more carefully. Conversations lowered into softer tones. Even the wedding band seemed hesitant while starting the next song near the dance floor. I sat back down at table 17 beside the kitchen doors while Grace squeezed my hand beneath the tablecloth without saying a word. Across the reception space, Michael stood frozen beside Vanessa while Ethan looked back and forth between all of us trying to understand what just happened. Then slowly, quietly, people began looking at me differently. Not with pity anymore, with recognition. Like they had finally noticed the woman sitting near the service entrance all evening. A waitress approached carrying fresh champagne glasses for our table. "That was beautiful," she whispered softly before hurrying away again. I almost laughed because apparently strangers understood dignity faster than family sometimes. 10 minutes later, Ethan finally crossed the reception floor toward me alone. His tuxedo jacket hung open now and his expression looked genuinely troubled beneath the glowing vineyard lights. "Grandma," he said quietly once he reached the table. "What did you mean up there?" Grace stood immediately beside me. "I am going to find the coffee station," she announced gently before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Ethan and me alone near the kitchen doors. I looked up at my grandson standing there beneath soft strings of white lights while guests pretended not to watch us from nearby tables. "Sit down, sweetheart." He lowered himself slowly into the chair beside me while the wedding band played softly in the background. "Dad says you embarrassed everyone." I smiled faintly because of course Michael would say that. People who spend years humiliating others quietly often panic the moment truth becomes visible publicly. "Did I?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I do not know." Honesty. Finally, I looked toward the dance floor where Olivia laughed nervously beside bridesmaids, while Vanessa whispered sharply into Michael's ear near the wine bar. "Do you know where I was sitting tonight?" I asked softly. Ethan frowned slightly. "At table 17? Do you know why?" His face changed slowly then. Confusion first, then discomfort. "No, neither do I." Silence settled between us while candlelight flickered softly across the vineyard tables. "Grandma," Ethan lowered his voice carefully. "Did Mom and Dad really ask you to stay out of family photos?" I looked directly at him for several seconds before answering. "Yes." The hurt on his face appeared instantly. Real. Unfiltered. Why would they do that? There it was. The question nobody else asked because everybody else already understood the answer too well. Appearances. Aesthetics. Youth. Wealthy families often become obsessed with curating perfection instead of practicing love. "I think your parents forgot something important a long time ago," I said gently. Ethan stared down at his untouched champagne glass. I had no idea, and somehow I believed him. Because unlike his parents, Ethan still looked embarrassed for someone else's pain instead of defensive about his own comfort. "You should go back to Olivia," I told him softly. "Tonight is still your wedding." But he remained sitting beside me while music drifted through the cool Napa air around us. "Did you really help pay for all this?" I almost smiled, hearing genuine shock in his voice. "Your grandfather left me enough money to help family when needed." Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across his forehead. Dad told everyone his business finally took off again. There it was. Another carefully polished version of reality. Michael has always cared deeply about appearances, I answered carefully. Across the reception space, Vanessa finally noticed Ethan sitting with me and immediately started walking toward our table in sharp, angry strides. Even from a distance, her expression looked strained now. "Ethan," she said tightly once she reached us, "Olivia is looking for you." He did not move immediately. Why was Grandma sitting back here? Vanessa blinked once, visibly caught off guard. "Sweetheart, seating arrangements were complicated." That is not an answer. I almost forgot how young people sound when they still expect honesty from adults automatically. Vanessa forced a tight smile toward him. "We just wanted the evening to feel cohesive visually." Cohesive visually. Ethan stared at her like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. "She is my grandmother." Vanessa's face hardened slightly then. "And this is my wedding too." There it was finally. Not family. Not logistics. Ownership. Image. The perfect wedding aesthetic apparently mattered more than dignity. Ethan stood slowly from the table while silence spread awkwardly around us. Nearby guests pretended intense fascination with desserts and wine glasses while secretly listening to every word. "You know what?" he said quietly to Vanessa. "I think Grandma should have been sitting at the family table from the beginning." Vanessa looked horrified hearing him say that publicly. Before she could answer, Michael appeared beside her already looking exhausted. "Ethan, please do not do this tonight." Ethan turned toward his father sharply. "No, Dad. You did this tonight." For a moment nobody spoke at all. The vineyard lights glowed warmly overhead, while music continued softly in the background, and somewhere beyond the reception tent, wind moved gently through the grapevines beneath the California night sky. Then unexpectedly, Ethan looked back toward me and held out his hand. "Grandma," he said quietly, "come dance with me." Tears burned instantly behind my eyes because after an entire evening of feeling invisible, my grandson finally saw me clearly. I placed my hand in his slowly while hundreds of tiny white lights flickered across the vineyard around us, and somewhere near the wine bar, Michael lowered his eyes toward the ground in shame. The entire reception changed after Ethan led me onto the dance floor. Not dramatically. Nobody gasped or stopped the music. But something shifted quietly beneath the vineyard lights while guests watched the groom dance slowly with the grandmother his own parents tried to hide beside the kitchen doors all evening. The band played an old Frank Sinatra song, while Ethan held my hand carefully the same way he used to crossing parking lots as a little boy. Around us, conversations softened into whispers. I could feel eyes following us across the dance floor, but for the first time that night, I no longer felt embarrassed. I felt visible. "I am sorry," Ethan whispered while we moved slowly beneath the hanging lights. I honestly did not know. I looked up at my grandson's face and saw genuine shame there. Not the polished social embarrassment his parents carried. Real shame. Human shame. "I know, sweetheart." Dad said the seating was random. I almost smiled. "Your father has spent years pretending many things were random." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "Grandma, have they really treated you like this for a long time?" The question hurt because I suddenly realized my grandson truly never noticed before. Maybe children do not see emotional exclusion clearly when it happens slowly enough. Or maybe I hid the pain too carefully all these years because protecting family peace felt easier than confronting loneliness honestly. "People get comfortable with kindness," I answered softly. "Sometimes too comfortable." Across the dance floor, I noticed Michael standing rigid near the wine bar, while Vanessa whispered sharply beside him. Neither looked at us directly anymore. Around them, several guests pretended not to stare while absolutely staring. Wealthy social circles survive on silence until somebody finally says the quiet part out loud. Then suddenly, everyone remembers they noticed the problem all along. When the song ended, Ethan hugged me tightly in front of the entire reception. "You should have been sitting with us tonight," he whispered into my shoulder. Tears burned instantly behind my eyes because after hours of humiliation, one simple sentence from the right person somehow healed more than anger ever could. "Thank you," I whispered back. Then, unexpectedly, Ethan took my hand again and led me directly toward the family table near the center of the vineyard courtyard. I saw Vanessa's face tighten immediately as we approached. Michael looked physically ill. "Move Grandma's place card," Ethan told a confused wedding coordinator standing nearby. "She is sitting here now." Silence spread softly around the nearest tables while guests pretended intense fascination with wine glasses and centerpieces. The coordinator hesitated awkwardly before nodding quickly. Vanessa stepped forward immediately, her smile stretched painfully thin beneath the vineyard lights. Ethan, sweetheart, the seating arrangement has already been finalized. Ethan looked directly at his mother in a way I had never seen before. Calm, firm, adult, then unfinalize it. For several seconds, nobody moved at all. Finally, the coordinator quietly carried my place, setting toward the family table, while guests nearby watched the scene unfold through lowered eyelashes and carefully controlled expressions. Michael rubbed one hand across his forehead like the entire evening physically exhausted him. Mom, he muttered quietly once I sat down beside Ethan. Was this really necessary? I looked around the family table while servers refilled wine glasses beside us. Vanessa's expensive floral arrangements glowed beautifully beneath the candles. Olivia smiled softly toward me from across the table, while Ethan squeezed my hand once beneath the linen cloth. No, I answered calmly. What was unnecessary happened long before tonight. Michael looked away immediately after that because deep down, he knew I was right. The rest of the reception continued awkwardly around us after that. People danced, toasted champagne, cut cake beneath sparkling lights while pretending the emotional earthquake near the family table never happened. But the atmosphere never fully recovered its polished perfection afterward. And honestly, I think that bothered Vanessa more than anything I actually said. Around midnight, while guests gathered near the vineyard exit for the sparkler send-off, Grace joined me quietly near the edge of the courtyard. You handled that beautifully, she whispered. I laughed softly under my breath. I did not plan any of it. The best truths rarely sound rehearsed. Across the driveway, Ethan and Olivia kissed beneath glowing sparklers while photographers snapped hundreds of pictures against the dark Napa sky. Michael stood beside Vanessa, smiling tightly for guests. But even from a distance, I could see the strain pulling at both their faces now. Their perfect wedding aesthetic had cracked permanently tonight. Not because I caused drama, because truth finally interrupted performance. As guests slowly began leaving the vineyard estate, Michael approached me alone near the valet station. His tuxedo jacket hung loose now, and exhaustion lined his face beneath the soft parking lot lights. Mom, he said quietly, I never wanted you to feel unwanted. I looked at my son standing there in the cool California night and suddenly saw both versions of him at once. The little boy who once cried when I left him at kindergarten, and the grown man who let his wife seat me beside the kitchen doors at his own son's wedding. Intentions matter less than patterns, I answered softly. Michael swallowed hard after that. Vanessa worries too much about appearances sometimes. I almost laughed hearing him reduce years of emotional exclusion into simple social anxiety. Michael, I said gently, your wife did not make these decisions alone. He looked down immediately because once again, the truth arrived too clearly to avoid. We stood there silently for a moment while valet attendants retrieved luxury cars beneath the vineyard lights. Then finally my son whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. I think somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing how lonely you were. Tears filled my eyes instantly hearing that because after everything tonight, this was the first honest thing he said to me all evening. I touched his arm gently before answering. And somewhere along the way, I stopped believing I deserved better. The valet pulled my car around then, headlights cutting softly across the dark vineyard driveway. I hugged Michael briefly before leaving, not because everything was magically healed, but because for the first time in years, we were finally speaking honestly instead of politely. As I drove away from the wedding beneath the cool Napa night sky, vineyard lights glowing faintly behind me in the rearview mirror, I realized something unexpected. Tonight was not the night my family humiliated me. Tonight was the night they finally saw me clearly enough to feel ashamed of it. 3 days after the wedding, Michael showed up at my house unannounced just before sunset. I saw his black SUV pull slowly into the driveway while I watered the small rose garden beside the porch. The California coast fog had started rolling inland early that evening, covering the hills in pale gray mist while cold wind moved softly through the trees. For a brief moment, watching my son step out of the driver's seat looking tired and uncertain, I almost remembered the little boy who used to run into my kitchen after school carrying scraped knees and unfinished homework. But life has a way of aging people emotionally long before wrinkles arrive. Michael walked toward me slowly with both hands buried deep inside his jacket pockets. Mom, he said quietly once he reached the porch. I turned off the hose and waited. Can I come in? The kitchen still smelled faintly like coffee and lemon cleaner from earlier that morning. I offered him tea automatically out of habit, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke while the kettle heated quietly beneath soft yellow lights. Michael sat at the same kitchen table where I once helped him study spelling words and algebra problems late into the night while his father traveled constantly for work. Funny how entire childhoods happen in ordinary rooms people eventually stop appreciating. Vanessa is furious, he admitted finally while staring down at his untouched teacup. About what exactly? He sighed heavily. The wedding, the speech, the guests talking afterward. I sat across from him calmly. People were already talking before I said anything. He rubbed one hand slowly across his face. You embarrassed her. There it was again. Somehow the greatest offense in our family was never humiliation itself. It was refusing to hide it politely afterward. Michael, I said softly, your wife seated me beside the kitchen doors at your son's wedding after asking me to stay out of family photographs. Because she worried about appearances. I almost smiled hearing him defend that sentence out loud. Do you hear yourself? He looked away immediately. Silence settled heavily between us while evening fog pressed softly against the kitchen windows outside. Finally, Michael leaned back in the chair and whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. Things are really bad financially. There it was. The real reason he came. Not guilt. Not reconciliation. Fear. I stayed quiet and let him continue. The restaurant investment completely collapsed. He stared down at his hands while speaking. We owe more than Vanessa realized. I remembered Grace telling me months earlier that Michael refinanced the house twice already. Suddenly, every polished family photograph from the last few years looked different in my memory. Less successful. More desperate. How bad? I asked calmly. He laughed bitterly under his breath. Bad enough that we might lose the house by next year. I felt something inside me go still hearing that. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Just recognition. Because suddenly, every family vacation I was excluded from, every awkward conversation about retirement savings, every carefully timed phone call asking for help finally aligned into one clear picture. You were planning to ask me for money after the wedding? I said quietly. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Mom, that is why Vanessa cared so much about appearances. She wanted the wedding to look wealthy enough that nobody questioned anything. He said nothing because silence confessed more honestly than explanations ever could. Outside, wind rattled softly through the rose bushes beside the porch while fog thickened across the darkening hills. I never wanted things to become like this, Michael whispered eventually. I looked at my son sitting across from me with tired eyes and expensive shoes bought during years he pretended success mattered more than connection. No, I answered gently. You just kept making choices that slowly led here. Tears filled his eyes suddenly then, though he blinked them away almost immediately. Michael always hated crying, even as a child. Vanessa thinks if you had not said anything publicly, people at the club would still support us. There it was again. Appearances. Reputation. Maintaining the illusion instead of confronting the truth underneath it. Michael, I said softly, your problems did not begin when I stopped protecting your image. He looked down at the table in silence. Do you know what hurt most at the wedding? I continued carefully. It was not the seating chart. His eyes lifted toward mine slowly. It was realizing your first instinct was to hide me instead of standing beside me. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke at all. Then finally Michael whispered, I think I became ashamed of needing you. That sentence landed harder than anything else he said all evening because deep down, I think it was true. Successful people often resent the very hands that quietly kept them afloat through failure. You did not need to be ashamed, I answered softly. You just needed to be honest. The kitchen fell quiet again while darkness settled fully outside the windows. Finally, Michael stood slowly from the table and walked toward the sink, staring out at the fog-covered hills beyond the backyard. I do not know how to fix any of this anymore. I looked at the back of my son's shoulders and suddenly saw how exhausted he truly was beneath the polished appearance he fought so hard to maintain. Some things cannot be fixed, I said gently, only faced honestly. He remained standing there another minute before finally turning back toward me. Vanessa thinks you hate her. I almost laughed hearing that because hatred requires emotional energy I no longer wanted to spend. No, I answered quietly. I think Vanessa loves appearances more than people. There is a difference. Michael nodded slowly like he already knew that too. When he finally left an hour later, the fog outside had swallowed most of the neighborhood completely. I stood at the front door watching his SUV disappear slowly into the gray California night while one painful realization settled deeply inside my chest. My son did not come here looking for forgiveness. He came because for the first time in his life, the image he spent years protecting finally collapsed. And suddenly, he remembered the mother he once believed would always clean up the mess afterward. 6 months after the wedding, I was standing barefoot on a quiet beach near Monterey watching waves roll slowly against the California shoreline when my phone buzzed with another message from Michael. The sky stretched pale gray above the ocean while cold wind moved softly through my jacket and gulls circled overhead near the cliffs. Grace stood several yards away collecting seashells like an excited child despite being nearly 70 herself. We had spent the last few months traveling slowly along the California coast together after I finally admitted I no longer wanted to sit alone in a silent house waiting for family members who only remembered me during emergencies. Carmel, Santa Barbara, Mendocino, places I once dreamed about visiting with my late husband, but never did because somebody always needed money, babysitting, or help with another crisis instead. Funny how life opens once you stop financing everyone else's comfort first. I looked down at the message glowing across my screen. Mom, can we talk? 3 years earlier, that sentence would have filled me with hope immediately. Now it mostly filled me with caution. Michael and Vanessa lost the house 2 months after the wedding. The restaurant investment collapsed completely, and apparently maintaining luxury appearances becomes difficult once creditors stop accepting promises. Grace heard most of the gossip through mutual friends at the country club. Vanessa blamed Michael. Michael blamed the economy. Both blamed stress. Nobody publicly blamed greed, though personally I thought greed deserved most of the credit. I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket without answering and continued walking along the shoreline while waves crashed softly against dark rocks nearby. Peace had become strangely addictive over the past 6 months. Not excitement, not revenge, just peace. The absence of constantly feeling emotionally responsible for other adults. The absence of waiting for crumbs of affection disguised as obligation. Grace finally caught up beside me carrying a handful of smooth white shells. Was that Michael again? She asked gently. I nodded once. Are you going to answer him? I stared toward the ocean while cold wind lifted my silver hair around my face. I do not know yet. Grace smiled softly beneath her scarf. That alone means you have changed. She was right. For most of my life, motherhood felt automatic, immediate, self-sacrificing to the point of disappearance. Every phone call from Michael once triggered instinctive concern before anything else. Now I finally paused long enough to ask whether helping actually solved anything or simply prolonged unhealthy patterns everybody became comfortable with. Later that evening, back at the small coastal inn where we were staying, I finally listened to Michael's voicemail while sitting beside the window watching fog drift slowly across the Pacific. His voice sounded exhausted. Older somehow. Mom, he said quietly, I know I do not deserve anything from you right now. Silence crackled softly through the speaker afterward. But I wanted to tell you something before you heard it from somebody else. My stomach tightened slightly. Vanessa left last week. I closed my eyes briefly while ocean waves moved faintly in the background beyond the hotel window. She said she was tired of struggling all the time. Another silence. Then finally, I think maybe she loved the life more than she loved me. I sat quietly beside the window while those words settled inside the room. Somewhere along the years, Michael became exactly the kind of man his father once warned him about. A man so obsessed with maintaining appearances that he stopped noticing whether anything underneath them remained real. I guess now I understand what you felt at the wedding, he whispered eventually. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes hearing that. Not because I wanted him punished. Because pain finally taught him empathy where comfort never could. I am sorry, Mom. The message ended there. No requests for money. No manipulation. Just apologies stripped bare of excuses for the first time in years. I replayed it twice before setting the phone aside, quietly beside the bed. Grace glanced up from her book across the room. How bad? Bad enough that he finally sounds honest. She nodded slowly like she understood exactly what I meant. The next morning, before leaving Monterey, I finally called Michael back. He answered immediately on the first ring. Mom. His voice carried surprise and exhaustion beneath it. Hi, sweetheart. Silence stretched gently between us for several seconds. Then finally he sighed quietly. I did not think you would call. I looked out toward the gray Pacific Ocean while early sunlight pushed weakly through the fog. You are still my son. His breathing cracked slightly after that. I really messed everything up. Yes, I answered softly. Honesty sounded kinder than comfort now. Another long silence followed. Vanessa moved to Phoenix with her sister, he admitted quietly. She said she could not live like this anymore. There was no bitterness in his voice anymore. Just emptiness. I remembered standing outside the vineyard wedding watching him smile beside expensive floral arrangements and polished guests, while secretly drowning financially beneath the surface. Sometimes people spend so much energy looking successful that they forget to build anything emotionally sustainable underneath it. Where are you staying? I asked. A small apartment near Sacramento. He laughed weakly under his breath. Honestly, it is the first place I have lived in years that feels real. I smiled sadly hearing that because maybe losing everything false was the only thing capable of teaching my son what mattered anymore. We talked quietly for nearly an hour afterward. Not about money. Not about blame. Just life. Grief. Loneliness. Consequences. Adult truths both of us avoided for too long. Before hanging up, Michael said something that stayed with me long afterward. I think you were the only person in the family who actually knew how to love without performing it. Tears filled my eyes instantly because after everything that happened, after the wedding humiliation and years of emotional neglect, my son finally understood the difference between appearances and presence. That evening, Grace and I drove south along the Pacific Coast Highway while sunset painted the ocean deep gold beside the cliffs. I rolled the windows down and let cold salt air fill the car while music played softly through the speakers. Somewhere far behind me existed vineyard weddings, seating charts, hidden shame, and all the exhausting performances families create to protect appearances instead of people. But ahead of me stretched open coastline, ocean air, and a life that finally belonged completely to myself. As the California sunset melted slowly into the Pacific, I realized something beautiful. Some families only love your usefulness. But the moment you stop begging to be included, you finally discover your own worth was never supposed to depend on their invitation in the first place.